We'll start with Fred Hitz over there, former Inspector General of the CIA, so don't tell him anything too important.
Kathleen, what a treat to have you down here to talk to us.
Such a pleasure.
Strikes me that the differences that you have all been pointing to between a desire to react positively to the plight of Syrian refugees gets pretty quickly hooked up into this 9/11 hangover. And in the context of Europe, the question of Schengen rules that we didn't talk about and the ability of a Brussels living terrorist to buy a ticket to go to Paris without any other formalities. How, as a practical matter, do we separate those two issues? Because I think the fear thing isn't really going to go away, is it? Except with the passage of time. And so to get behind the real needs of the Syrian refugees themselves without other baggage, is a tough sell.
It certainly is, Fred, and I can't think of any other way to sort of attack that wall of fear than to try to help people get acquainted with who these people really are. I mean, there was a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post about a month ago by a Syrian refugee, a woman whom I'd happened to meet a few weeks before that. And she wrote, the headline on this piece was, "They killed my baby, they terrorized my daughter, that's why I'm a Syrian refugee." And nobody could read her story or hear her story and not be moved by it and not want to help her. At least, I don't think many people could. They'd have to be really mean. So I think that, again, people who know refugees, people who know immigrants, tend to have much more positive attitudes than people who don't have any personal acquaintance with them. So I think the media has a huge responsibility here, and I think that's a big part of what generates this fear, is that echo chamber within some parts of mass media. And I think others just have to really try to counter that and to keep bringing the reality check down to, these are real people. They're just like you and me in many ways, and you're not going to be afraid of them if you know who they are.
I've read that the deportation rate from Germany was 60 people per day in December. It's now increased to over 200 per day, and they're being sent to Austria. I'm wondering what becomes of these people who are deported from Germany.
I'm not sure about the Austria part of it. I know they have stepped up the deportation rate very considerably, and I think I think so far they've deported 18,000 people in the second part of the year, and mostly these are people who are being deported to the Western Balkans. Again, people who have been through sort of fast-track refugee determination procedures because it's assumed that they aren't refugees because of where they come from. Now, there's some problems with that prima facie determination that someone is not a refugee, because almost any country is capable of generating refugees. A lot of our asylees come from Mexico, which is generally, it's not a country at war, but has some serious problems with rule of law and gender discrimination and things like that. So I think the Germans know that they have to start deporting non-refugees, and they are beginning to. They've set up some facilities, essentially detention centers for people from the Western Balkans who they judge to be extremely unlikely to gain asylum. And are getting more serious about that. It's going to be much more difficult with some of the other groups, Egyptians who are claiming to be Syrian, Pakistan. You've even had Pakistanis and Indians claiming to be Syrian. They can't speak Arabic and they can't tell you what the main street in Damascus is, but they say, I'm Syrian, I'm a refugee. You know, these are not easy procedures. But it can be done. There's a lot of experience in the UN Refugee Agency, for example, in doing refugee determination procedures. These are the questions, they're protocols, or the questions you ask to determine if someone really is who they say they are.
Where do the deportees go?
Back to their country of origin.
But so someone fleeing Syria makes it to Germany, gets deported, but presumably if you're actually fleeing Syria, you wouldn't get sent back.
You wouldn't get
So it's
deported.
only a fake fleeing Syrian who.
There are more than 90% of of people claiming asylum who are from Syria get asylum. But those who don't could have been living in another country where they were safe. They just decided they wanted to come to Germany for some reason. It's like 80% of Afghans get asylum. But those who don't can be sent back to safe parts of Afghanistan, and are.
And I think what's worth emphasizing, and Kathleen, you know this far better than I, so you can correct me when I err, is when the designation of refugees is very particular in terms of, people have to have a fear of persecution, fear of to their life, right? That is why there's not a classification for people fleeing bad economies or people fleeing natural disasters, right? So the idea of a climate refugee legally does not make sense, right? There's no such thing. So when you think about how individuals get classification of refugees, right, or when they seek refuge, it is a determination and a designation that a place like Syria would not be a safe place for that individual to be returned to, okay? At the same time, governments, and I read this in the paper this morning, the German government has decreed that Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria are now safe. So that people who are claiming, I'm saying from a policy point of view, right? That they are safe enough that there's not a blanket acknowledgement of refugee status for individuals from those countries who are seeking refuge or asylum status in Germany proper, right? So that's why this distinction is really very important. And one more thing is that's why a lot of policymakers, a lot of politicians, I should say, are hesitant to talk about these individuals as refugees, right? They talk about this as an immigration or a migrant crisis, not necessarily a refugee crisis, because once you call it something, you have an obligation to then act in accordance with international law and UN declarations.
Very interesting. Well, let's go a question here, and then we'll come to here.
The immigration numbers are staggering. How does a country like Germany successfully integrate over 1 million people?
Well, it's a big country, and it's a very wealthy country, and it needs labor. So I think the chancellor has been pretty consistent in saying it's become one of the most sort of renowned phrases in the sort of German yearbook for 2015. We can manage it, and I think that's true of Germany. But it has to be managed, and what that means is language instruction. It means opening the apprenticeship programs and technical schools to refugees, which industry is eager to do. I mean, Siemens, Daimler-Benz have been recruiting in the refugee shelters for young people to come into their apprenticeship programs. It takes a short to medium-term investment that can result in a very long-term high payoff for countries like northern Western European countries. Now, ironically, the countries that have the very lowest birth rates are the Eastern European, the former communist countries. They're the ones who really need immigrants, and they're the ones who are most resistant. It's partly a resource question, but I think it's even more a cultural question.
It is interesting how we have forgotten that that It used to be that one of the hallmarks of power of a nation was the more people you had, the more powerful you were. And generally, most of us pay for ourselves ultimately, and that's what refugees do too. But we lose sight of that. We sort of get this idea that refugees or the new arrivals are going to be expensive new additions forever, as opposed to the people who are going to pay my retirement in 20 years. But let's go right here.
If I could just add one thing on that, I mean, this is part of the European integration problem, is that they have this very, the very strong welfare state has tended to keep people out of the labor market. And I mean, Germany just reduced the time during which an asylum seeker is not allowed to work from 9 months to 3 months. But you can understand why it drives people crazy in Europe, seeing healthy young men sitting around doing nothing, living in public housing, because they are not allowed to work. And this is beginning to change, and it should.
I had a question about who the Syrian refugees are. The German confidence that they can be quickly integrated into the economy and help fill this demographic hole. I mean, I've read things in the press that indicate there are many middle-class people, and that the people who are doing this tend to be educated, courageous, and bold, and so forth. Is that really true, or is that only a small subset of those people who are fleeing to Europe from Syria?
I think it's a pretty large subset, actually, partly because the poor can't afford to migrate. If you look at what smugglers charge to get somebody across the Mediterranean, even with a phony life jacket and one of these flimsy boats, it's a lot of money. And if you're moving a family of 4, you need thousands and thousands of dollars to get that done. So many of the people who are coming are middle class, are educated, there are a lot of people in the sort of mid-skilled professions where, Syria had a very strong and ancient artisan tradition. It's one of the reasons the German industry is so interested in them. So there are a lot of skilled and semi-skilled people among them. Syria is also really sort of disputes with Egypt of being the center of Arab culture. It's an ancient culture. I went there just a couple of months before the uprising started, and I could hardly wait to go back. I mean, it's such an interesting, deep, rich culture, which is so destroyed now. So they're people who have a lot to offer, and I think they will integrate well. I mean, the Syrian community in the United States is very small. It's like 170,000 people in the Syrian diaspora here. But it's an extremely successful community. And I would say it's not just Muslims either. There's Syrian Christians. The managing editor of the New York Times is of Syrian Jewish descent. It was a melting pot of deep and rich culture. And that's an advantage, compared to some of the refugees we take into this country who have done rather well, who are pre-literate, not even literate in their own languages, who've had no education, no exposure to, turning on a light switch or using modern plumbing. Even those people, tend to do pretty well. Syrians will be fine.
My question is for Professor Leblang, and I wanted you to comment about what you think the future of the Schengen zone is, given that the attacks of the Friday the 13th in Paris, and whether you think one of the perpetrators is still at large, who's easily passed between Belgium and France, and it's just like a sieve where these people go back and forth.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic. Again, one of the other things that I make lists because I can't remember all of them, right? But in the since June of last year, there have been borders erected. Greece, Hungary, Bulgaria, Estonia, Slovakia, Austria, Slovenia, and Macedonia, right, to try and decrease flows of refugees. Recently, you've had Denmark and Sweden that have implemented border checks to make sure that people entering those countries have visas that are legitimate. Okay, and I think France has done the same thing. Germany has done the same thing. So I'm worried about this, and again, I would have said that I was worried about this even before the refugee crisis, because I think we saw some of the beginnings of some of the beginnings of a desire to close borders, if not in a de facto sense, then in a de jure sense, as a result of the financial crisis, when we saw a large-scale migration from Southern Europe into Northern Europe, right? And then you saw an increase in the labor market competition, an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, right? With the rise of these radical right-wing parties, they might not have sufficient support to withdraw a country from the European Union, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see piecemeal attempts to break down Schengen piece by piece, saying we might not need a fence, but we need to be more limited in terms of the number of third-party nationals that come in, the number of Greeks that come in, the number of Poles that come in, or something like that. So I'm an optimist on almost everything. This I'm not so optimistic about.
Let's hear from, I think that's David Martin back there, another esteemed expert on this topic from the UVA Law School.
Thanks very much. That was very enlightening what you provided. I jotted down a couple of key phrases. Scale matters, timing matters, concerns about uncontrolled flows, I think really have much more of an impact than necessarily just the scale. And you mentioned there's going to be a need for some greater controls. Germany can't really effectively absorb 1 million year after year. But along those lines, the question is, what can really be done? Don't we need some more innovative and wider-ranging thinking about what can be done to establish better control? Quicker refugee status determinations, deportation of people who fail is important, but that's going to be much more applicable in other populations besides Syrians. So I think there needs to be more done to regulate people at the source. There have been some efforts to try to talk to Turkey. It hasn't shown much yet about doing that, but to keep people there until they're selected to move elsewhere. Is that a possibility? Is that in the discussion now? Or what other kinds of things can be done to regulate this more effectively? Because deportations a few years out is, I think, not going to do it.
It's top of mind, I think, for most European policymakers now is what to do, and certainly the effort to get Turkey to cooperate. The Turks, I've been working fairly closely with the Turkish government on other things in the last year, and they kind of are Europeans. We have 2.2 million Syrian refugees in our country. Do the Europeans really want to send people back to us? Or do they want to bottle them up here? You know, people in Europe go on and on about burden sharing, responsibility sharing. Well, what about sharing some of our burdens? And there's a real sense of grievance in the region that until the problem presented itself on Europe's doorstep, Europe was perfectly willing to, not pay too much attention or not develop too much of a sense of urgency about it. Now, this is human, but it doesn't make the Turks and the Jordanians and the Lebanese much more inclined to help solve Europe's problems, unless they're heavily bribed. So heavy bribes may be part of the answer. What is much more in the policy discourse now is development solutions, so that people will not feel the sense of despair and desperation that is leading them to leave those countries of first asylum where they can't work, their kids aren't in school, they have no future. And it's that despair rather than hunger or grievance or even violence, I think, that's driving people out. So something to alleviate that despair. But simplistic thinking about, development as a cure for migration is really just going to lead to frustration, because if anything, development actually leads to more migration because more people have the money to move and have wider horizons. So this is not a problem that's going to be solved. I mean, that's my first advice to policymakers is abandon hope that you're going to solve this problem. If you're lucky, you'll manage it. And you'll manage it piece by piece and with lots of different moving parts and with lots of frustrations. But you can manage it. I believe Angela Merkel speaks the truth.
And I think I'll add just two things to this. I mean, one is that if you pull back and look more broadly, we can understand or we can observe how the United States on the one hand or the European Union on the other has used foreign aid, for example, as a tool, right? Just a single tool to try and deal with the demand for entry into these countries. So think about the role that Libya played prior to the Civil War. They received an enormous amount of foreign aid from the European Union. One way to read that aid was that the hope was that Libya would end up being a buffer state. Okay, that refugees from or migrants coming from North Africa would get to Libya and they would stay there, right? Likewise, in the foreign aid write-up, the U.S. foreign aid bill from last year, maybe it was 2 years back, the United States gave an increased allocation to Mexico, and the line item was to specify that Mexico was to protect, some of this aid was to go for Mexico to protect its southern border. Right, so that there would be a deterrent for Central Americans who were trying to get to the United States. Well, now they couldn't get to Mexico, right? So foreign aid has been used as a tool in this fight. The second piece, and again, I'll punt this back to Kathleen in a second. One of the more interesting policy initiatives that I've seen in the last 8 years is the last few years when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She convened, I think it was the Global Diaspora Forum.
I organized it.
So you can speak more. You can speak more to this. But one of the things that was really quite interesting about that was pulling together diaspora organizations so that there could be a conversation about how not only to raise funds, but how to channel funds back to the home country. So that it's not just giving aid to Mexico, it's channeling not aid, but channeling resources from the diaspora back to the communities from which they came. The idea being that then you will increase the quality of life in those countries and you will decrease the demand for exit on the part of individuals who live in those communities. Part of that endeavor, the World Bank is continuing to work on measures to try and decrease the cost of remittances. Okay? So as migrants send remittances home, presumably that enables individuals to have more income for consumption and decreases their desire or their need to immigrate to richer countries.
It's definitely not a linear relationship, is all I would say. I mean, you can see over the long term that richer countries that enjoy rule of law and stability don't have as many people migrating out of desperation. But, Mexico and the United Kingdom have the same proportion of migrants in the United States. Mexico and England. And, nobody thinks that migration from England to this country is a problem.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I saw a cartoon recently with a caption something like, we used to be good at assimilating immigrants. Is that true? And if so, why aren't we good anymore?
We are. You just look at language acquisition as one of the main indicators. Second generation immigrants in this country almost universally speak English. Third generation don't speak their mother tongue, their grandmother tongue, I guess that is. This country is a language graveyard, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it is, an indicator of I would say integration rather than assimilation, because integration implies a two-way street. But we've just done a recent study at the Migration Policy Institute on outcomes of resettled refugees of refugees, not just resettled refugees in this country. And the indicators are very good. It varies by group, but if you look, the Vietnamese diaspora median household income is higher than the American average. It's a good story when you look at the data, and I think it's an even better story when you look at our cities and the opportunity that not that there aren't lots of problems with particularly with residential segregation and some communities, but by and large, it's a good story, and the extent to which we really remain a mixing bowl, if not a melting pot, is to me.
Trouble assimilating Muslim?
No, no, we never have. You know, they say you look at Dearborn, Michigan. You look at Muslim communities around the country, and until you start demonizing groups, they don't self-identify as being apart from the mainstream society. I think that's the real danger. There's a wonderful comedian who we had perform at the first Global Diaspora Forum, who has a Palestinian father and an Italian mother, and he's hilarious, talking about family dynamics. But he talks about, you know, how perceptions of him changed after 9/11, and goes into this shtick about how white people look at immigrants of color, and he says, "I know this. I used to be white." And it just shows you that perceptions can change.
David, final thought?
Yeah, I would just add to the gentleman's question. You know, if you want some really hands-on experience in thinking about the extent to which integration and assimilation work, you know, I moved to Charlottesville 7 years ago from Colorado, and my kids go to Greenbrier Elementary School, or they did, which is the elementary school that is in the area where the IRC has resettled large numbers of refugees. And I remember being struck when I think my son came home from kindergarten or first grade, and I learned that 16 different languages were taught at that elementary school, and that didn't include Spanish. Right, and so to think about, you know, as a community, and again, we're just one of these resettlement cities, you know, to think about how integration works at the real micro level, which is where you have to look.
It's where it happens.
You have to think about the kinds of services that are provided, but you also have to think about what these migrants bring to the community. Right? So again, I was struck and deeply affected by the extent to which, when my kids came home, they were talking about all of these other kids that looked different from them. They asked questions about headscarves. They asked about different shades of skin. They asked about, you know, why were there kids from Nepal or from Azerbaijan? And I thought that was really a marvelous thing. That was a gift that I felt that, you know, as my wife and I, who are you know, white people, you know, this is a gift that we are giving our children, and I think it's a gift that we have in our community.
That's great. Thank you both very much.
Well said. Pardon? Well said.
It struck me. I didn't realize. You know,